Hank Miller, a veteran at 65, thought he knew the Montana wild. But when a freezing mama bear and cubs arrived during a record-breaking storm, he faced a choice that would change his life and redefine survival forever. The wind didn't just blow that night, it screamed like a wounded ghost. Hank sat by his old cast-iron stove, his hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. Outside, the world was vanishing. A polar vortex had descended on the mountains, and the temperature had dropped to 45 degrees below zero. In this part of Montana, nature doesn't give you a second chance. If you're outside in that kind of cold, your blood slows down, and your breath turns to ice in your lungs. Hank was used to the silence of his cabin, but this night felt different. There was a strange weight in the air, a pressure that made his old war injuries ache. Suddenly, a heavy, dull thud echoed through the house. It wasn't the wind, it was a knock, a desperate, heavy pounding against the side of his cabin. Hank stood up, his heart thumping against his ribs. He grabbed his flashlight, wondering who could possibly be out in this white hell. He looked through the frosted window, and his breath caught in his throat. Standing on his porch was a massive grizzly sow. Her fur was matted with ice, looking like armor made of frozen needles. She wasn't standing tall to attack. She was hunched over, her head low. Rushing against her frozen legs were two tiny cubs. They were shivering so hard they could barely stand. One of them let out a high-pitched cry that cut right through the roar of the gale. Hank froze. Every rule of the wilderness said to stay inside. You don't help a grizzly. You don't invite a 300-pound predator into your home. But then, he saw it. The mother bear looked directly into the window. Her eyes weren't full of rage. They were full of a deep, hollow exhaustion. She nudged her smallest cub toward the door. It was a plea. Hank's hands shook as he reached for the bolt of his mudroom. "I must be crazy," he whispered. He didn't open the main door, but he swung open the side entrance to his insulated tool shed and mudroom. "In here, quick!" he shouted. The bear didn't hesitate. She pushed her cubs through the threshold and stepped in, her massive body filling the small room. Hank slammed the door and locked it, his back pressed against the wood. He was now just inches away from a beast that could end him in a second. The bear didn't move toward him. She simply sank to the floor. The heat from the cabin began to melt the ice on her fur, creating a thick mist in the small room. She began to lick her cubs, her heavy tongue moving with a gentleness that brought tears to Hank's eyes. He retreated behind the inner glass door, watching them. They were safe. For now, the mountain had lost its prey. But folks, don't go anywhere, because the mountain wasn't done with them yet. There was something else out there in the dark. An hour passed. Hank was sitting in his kitchen, watching the bears through the glass. He felt a strange sense of peace until he saw the mother bear's ears twitch. She let out a low, vibrating growl that he felt in his own teeth. Outside the mudroom window, a pair of glowing yellow eyes appeared. It was a mountain lion, a big, hungry tom. These cats are smart. They know when a grizzly is too weak to fight. The lion began to circle the cabin, its paws making no sound on the porch. Hank watched in horror as the cat jumped onto the roof. He could hear the scratching of claws right above the bears. The mother bear tried to stand, but her legs were still stiff from the cold. She was trapped. Hank knew he had to do something. He couldn't use his rifle. The noise in that small room would make the grizzly panic. He remembered his old military gear. He grabbed a high-intensity flare and a heavy metal trash can lid. He cracked the inner door and threw the flare out into the snow near the window. At the same time, he began to bang the lid with a hammer, screaming at the top of his lungs. The burst of red light and the sudden metallic clatter were too much for the cat. The mountain lion hissed, leaped from the roof, and vanished into the storm. The silence returned, heavier than before. The mother bear looked at Hank. She let out a soft huff and put her head back down on her paws. It was the first time Hank felt like they truly understood each other. They were both just trying to see the sun rise. He brought a bowl of water and some dried meat, sliding it through a small gap. The bear accepted it without a sound. "Stay with me," because the morning brought a discovery that would test Hank's heart even more. The first light of dawn turned the snow into a field of diamonds. The storm had passed, leaving a world of white silence. Hank checked on his guess. The mama bear was stronger, but the smallest cub was not moving. It was curled in a tight ball, its breathing shallow. Hank had been a medic in the service. He knew the signs of deep hypodermia. He couldn't just stand there. He put on his thickest leather gloves and stepped into the mudroom. The mama bear stood up, her shadow looming over him. "Easy, girl. I'm a friend. I just want to help the little one," Hank said, his voice low and steady. To his amazement, she stepped back. She allowed him to pick up the cub. Its body was like a block of ice. Hank sat on the floor and began to rub the cub's chest, using the friction to jumpstart its heart. He did this for 20 minutes, his own muscles aching. Suddenly, the cub let out a tiny sneeze and wiggled its ears. Hank let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. But as he looked out the window to see if the coast was clear, he saw a shadow near his woodpile. It was a mother deer, a doe. She was lying in the snow, her leg pinned under a massive tree limb that had snapped during the storm. She looked exhausted, her eyes wide with terror. Hank realized the mountain lion from the night before had likely been hunting her before it found the cabin. He couldn't leave her there to die. He grabbed his shovel and ran outside. He worked like a man half his age, digging through the heavy drifts. He used a long pole to pry the heavy limb off the doe's leg. She struggled at first, but then she realized he was helping. When she was finally free, she didn't run. She was too weak. Hank led her to the small roofed area where he kept his hay for the winter. He gave her a warm mash and some dry bedding. He walked back into the cabin, exhausted but full of a strange, buzzing energy. By noon, the mama bear was ready. She stood at the door, her cubs at her heels. Hank opened the outer door. The fresh, cold air rushed in. The bear stepped out, her fur now dry and fluffy. She stopped on the porch and turned around. She looked at Hank for a long, quiet moment. It wasn't a look of a wild animal. It was the look of a soul saying thank you. Then with a flick of her tail, she and her cubs disappeared into the pine trees. The doe also eventually stood up and limped back into the thicket. Hank was alone again, but the cabin didn't feel empty anymore. Now, you might think the story ends there, but the mountains of Montana have a long memory. And 6 months later, Hank would find out just how long. The summer in Montana is a beautiful thing. The valleys turn a deep, rich green, and the smell of wild sage fills the air. Hank spent his days fixing his fence and enjoying the warmth. He often thought about that night in February. He wondered if the cubs were growing. He wondered if the doe was still roaming the hills. One hot afternoon in August, Hank decided to drive into the small town of Big Fork to get some supplies. He needed flour, salt, and some fresh fruit. He climbed into his old Ford F-150, a truck that had been with him for 20 years. He started the engine and began the slow drive down the winding mountain road. The road was narrow with a steep cliff on one side and a rocky wall on the other. It was a beautiful drive, but you had to be careful. There were dead man's curves where you couldn't see what was coming around the bend. Hank was about 5 miles from his house when he saw something strange. A massive shape was sitting right in the middle of the gravel road. As he got closer, he realized it was a grizzly. He slowed down, expecting the bear to run off into the brush. But the bear didn't move. Hank honked his horn. The bear stayed put. Hank came to a complete stop about 20 feet away. He realized it was her, the same mama bear. She was much bigger now, her coat healthy and dark. Her cubs, now half-grown, were sitting on the side of the road. "Hey there, girl, it's me. I need to get through," Hank yelled out the window. The bear didn't budge. In fact, she did something terrifying. She stood up on her hind legs. She looked like a giant, her head reaching higher than the top of his truck. She let out a roar that shook the glass in the windows. Hank's heart started racing. Was she attacking? Had she forgotten him? He tried to pull forward slowly, hoping she would step aside. Instead, she lunged toward the truck and slammed her massive paws onto the hood. The truck rocked on its springs. Hank slammed it into reverse, his hands shaking on the wheel. "What's wrong with you?" he shouted. The bear wouldn't let him pass. She stayed in the road, her eyes fixed on him with a strange intensity. She seemed frantic. Hank turned off the engine. He realized the bear wasn't trying to hurt him. If she wanted to kill him, she would have ripped the door off by now. She was stopping him. She was standing like a sentry, a guardian of the road. Hank sat there, his breath coming in quick gasps. He looked at the bear, and then he looked at the road ahead. He felt a cold chill run down his spine, even in the August heat. Folks, what happened next is something Hank still struggles to talk about. It was a moment that defied logic. Hank sat in the silence of his truck for 3 minutes. Suddenly, the air changed. A low, deep hum began to vibrate through the floor of the truck. It sounded like a swarm of a million bees. Then the hum turned into a roar. Hank looked up at the cliffside just 50 yards ahead of him. The entire side of the mountain began to slide. It wasn't just a few rocks. It was a massive landslide. Tons of earth, boulders the size of houses, and giant pine trees came crashing down across the road. The sound was deafening, like a freight train falling from the sky. The road where Hank would have been driving, the exact spot where he would have been if the bear hadn't stopped him, was buried under 20 feet of rubble and stone. The dust cloud was so thick it turned the afternoon into twilight. Hank sat frozen, his face pale as a sheet. If he had been 1 minute faster, he would have been crushed instantly. He looked at the bear. She was back on all fours now. She looked at the dust, then she looked at Hank. She let out one final soft huff. She turned and nudged her cubs, and together, they climbed the steep bank and disappeared into the thick forest. Hank couldn't move for a long time. He sat in his truck, the engine off, listening to the settling rocks. He realized that this animal, this predator he had saved in the middle of a winter storm, had just returned the favor. She had felt the vibrations of the mountain. She had known the danger was coming, and she had waited for him. She had saved his life. Hank eventually turned his truck around and drove back home. He didn't go to town that day. He went home, sat on his porch, and watched the sun set over the peaks. He felt a deep, profound connection to the world around him. He wasn't just a man living in the woods anymore. He was part of something much bigger. Nature has a way of balancing the scales. We think we are the ones in control, the ones who decide who lives and who dies. But every now and then, the wild reminds us that we are all in this together. Hank Miller learned that a little bit of kindness, a single act of mercy on a cold February night, can ripple out and save a life months down the line. It doesn't matter if you have 2 legs or 4, the language of the heart is universal. If this story reminded you that there is still good in the world, please leave a comment below. I want to hear your stories of hope. And if you're looking for more incredible moments that will touch your soul, click the video on the screen right now. There are so many more stories to tell, and I'm so glad you're here to hear them. Don't forget to subscribe so we can stay connected. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next one.